Hello everyone, today we're going to be talking about watercolors and a couple different watercolor techniques that you can use in the classroom and that we will be using in the coming up watercolor unit. So here's just kind of a video reference / take home and learn ahead on the watercolor process. The first thing to know about watercolors are there are a couple different techniques you can use to achieve some different looks on your paintings. There are dry techniques, wet on dry and dry on dry. There are wet techniques, which wet on dry is another one, but I'll show you a variation on it, and the wet on wet technique. You always want to use a good amount of water with your watercolors. It really helps the pigment to spread and it helps you to load up your brush too. You want to use a decent amount of pigment on it. Otherwise, it's hard to see. Watercolor can thin out quite a bit if you use too much water. So here's the wet on dry, which start out with a thin line. And the nice thing about watercolors is you can come in with more water and actually drop it down into there and blend it out. But the wet on dry lets you have a background color, and then you can come in with your own wet media, and it gives kind of an interesting effect. The thing with watercolors is they will only go where you've laid down water for them. So I can make a trail of water onto my dry background and then drop my pigment in where my water was, and it will only go where I previously laid down the water. So the next technique is dry on dry, and dry on dry, you want to have good watercolors to do dry on dry. You're using the watercolors with the least amount of water you can to paint with. You have to have a tiny amount just to be able to get the paint moving and started. But watercolor paper has texture, and so it soaks up paint pretty quick. Just get a tiny dab of water. And you can see it highlights the texture of the paper pretty well. You can get more water in, but eventually the dryness is going to pull it out pretty quick. So with that kind of stuff, beach grass is a good example of something you can do with this technique, because as it pulls out towards the end, you get nice texture. Like that. So we kind of already talked about how wet on dry works with the dry techniques, but there's another way you can do wet on dry. I'm going to start by loading my paintbrush up with just water. And this is our wet onto our dry paper. Watercolor paper can take quite a bit of water, so you can be pretty liberal with this. I'm going to load up some paint, and then you just drop it into the water. You can add more water to get the color to bloom out. Come back in, add more pigment. Maybe add a different color pigment. Come back, add more water. So you can even add more colors in, and you will get some mixing, but if you're doing just the drop-in technique, they like to stay on their own a little bit too. The last technique is wet on wet, which is pretty obviously wet paint on wet paint, and it's going to act similarly to wet on dry in some ways. But this tends to bleed a little more than the wet on dry. Let's see, good contrast color. Maybe So when you're dropping wet paint into wet paint and you pull around in it and you're not just making little drops, it'll blend and you can make almost a gradient design. I could come back and if I really wanted to be crazy, drop a little blue there. But each of the different watercolor techniques is going to lend for certainly a different effect. And it helps you to give realism and sometimes just kind of a little bit of funky extra to your watercolor paintings. So there's a couple other things that you can do to add some interest to your watercolor piece. I personally am a big fan of splattering. You just have to do it nicely. And I'm going to try and do this with one hand. But if you flick the brush, let's get more color. You can get a neat little splatter effect. And you can do that in more than just one color if you wanted. Try something a little different. On that same technique as you saw there, sometimes you can get drip spatter. If you load it up a lot, you can a lot of times get some pretty big drips just by tapping it. Okay, now I wiped our pretty splatter so I could have more room for the blooming. You saw some of this on the other side with some of the wet on wet. I'm gonna give another little demo here. So blooming is when you have an area that's really heavy loaded with color or water and you dump in another color by just putting the tip in of it. And you can bring water back in. And it kind of, I guess, is called blooming because everything almost pawns out like a flower blooming when you put it in the water. So next technique is blotting, and for this I'm going to also need a paper towel. And I'm going to go with a pretty dark color so you can see this well. Okay, you can come in with the paper towel and blot. And then you can even, alright, so there's the blotting done. I took quite a bit off, but I like the texture it creates. The last technique I'm going to show you is a resist. You can do this with crayons. White crayons especially turn out really neat for this, or clear ones. I didn't have any crayons handy, so I just dripped some candle wax. The same purpose. Waxes will resist the watercolor, so anywhere that you have the wax laid down, it will repel it. It kind of creates neat patterning and a different element to it. You can go in. So it's kind of fun to keep dropping some different colors in on top of where you've done a resist. The repelling effects kind of do some neat stuff. It's a really weird color. So yeah, it's a couple different interesting techniques you can use, and hopefully this will make starting the watercolor unit a little bit easier to understand and maybe inspire you guys to have a few ideas.